All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio. Now, we've been talking about the O.J. Simpson case a lot on this channel, and I'll get back to some other subjects hopefully tomorrow, but there's just one more upload I wanted to do because I need to give a shout out to YouTube user disco underscore. And I would just like to say thank you for sharing a bunch of links for me, especially the Porkins Policy radio podcast. That was something that I found very interesting and helpful for this one. It featured some interviews with an individual named Steven Singular, and he is actually the author of the book Talk to Death, which is about the murder of Alan Berg. And I haven't actually read that book yet, but I did read some of the reviews of it for Talk to Death when I was composing my upload for this channel on Alan Berg, and I didn't recognize the name, and then he mentioned that, and it kind of brought back some memories. But he also wrote a book on the O.J. Simpson case, which centered on Mark Furman and his racial prejudice, and it really reveals a lot of things. So I guess that's a good starting point for today. Let's talk about the first theory. This is an alternate theory in which O.J. Simpson is not implicated at all in the 1994 murders of Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson. And yes, there really is. I mean, before we get into the theory, I just need to say there really is a large movement online of people that insist that OJ is just innocent, framed completely, had nothing to do with this. They're called OJ truthers by some. And one of these theories is that simply, before we even identify a killer, just that Mark Furman and Van Adder planted the blood evidence in OJ's home and in the Bronco and in all of these things, that this was not connected to OJ in any way. And the reasons why is that what Steven Singular reveals is that Mark Furman had actually met with OJ in the 1980s. He was, a detective that had been called to the house because of a domestic dispute. I mean, I guess you would say he was a police officer at that time, and he had been called to the house in Rockingham because of a dispute between Nicole and OJ. So he had met OJ once in the 1980s. And furthermore, he had multiple meetings with Nicole Brown Simpson over the course of the next 10 years. And like they were, I mean, Singular stresses that they were not intimate at that level. Like they never really had an intimate relationship, but Mark Furman actually had an infatuation with Nicole Brown Simpson. And he's sort of saying that that is a motive for Mark Furman to frame OJ. What I would say about this theory is that my first instinct is that, like, wow, this sounds like a little bit low probability. But what I would agree with is some things that are put forward is that Stephen Singular argues that Van Adder and Furman both would have had access to OJ's blood for a variety of hours that would have gone unaccounted for. It's like they would have had both the ability to do this. Also, Mark Furman allegedly made multiple trips in between Rockingham and Bundy, in between OJ's house and the murder scene during the investigation before anything had been during the night of the incident, let's say that for lack of a better term. So Mark Furman would have had a complete opportunity to do this, like the time frame as well as motive and the means to do so, to kind of start messing around with the crime scene. Not to mention, once they got OJ's blood, then there was also be a certain amount of time when it would have been possible for Furman and Van Adder to go after OJ Simpson. This also saying that this is racially motivated. I mean, we don't really need to go into question Mark Furman's character, whether or not he's a racist or not. I mean, I think that goes without saying. All right, so that's one possibility, that this was somebody else and that Mark Furman staged the scene, and well, Furman and Van Adder. Is this possible? Well, once again, like, even though there is a very, very excellent presentation from Steven Singular, I would say that for this you're really going to need more of a smoking gun. Um, you're really going to need more of a definitive standpoint. Like, you're just going to need some larger piece of concrete evidence against Furman, and maybe I can go through some of the more of these podcasts from Porkins Policy Radio, and we can see if anything is there. Now, another one here is actually coming to us from F. Lee Bailey, one of the defense attorneys from O.J. Simpson. What Bailey says, his theory about the case, is that Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were actually targeted because of a case of mistaken identity. Once again, Ron Goldman was a waiter at La Mezzaluna, and Nicole Brown Simpson was a frequent guest there. She was also caught up in the drug trade at La Mezzaluna, because La Mezzaluna was basically a front for a bunch of drug dealings and illegal activity. And this is a very wide theory on the internet that Ron Goldman and Nicole were killed because of something associated with the drug trade. But what I thought was notable about F. Lee Bailey's theory is that he says it was a case of mistaken identity, that somebody thought that they were two different people, that somebody thought that they were just they went after them because they thought that they were somebody else from La Mezzaluna, but in reality they were not. They got the wrong people, in other words. And this was from Ranker.com that posted this theory. And what they were saying is that plausible but not likely. And that is just, I have to agree 100%. And once again, though, I mean, if you don't think that it was, if you think that this was just a case of mistaken identity, that some people working for the drug lords want to kill Nicole and Ron with, as a mistake, and then how do you get OJ's footprint and blood evidence at the crime scene? I mean, does this theory have to work in conjunction with Mark Furman? I mean, it's starting to get a little complicated and wacky at that point. Now, the next one we want to talk about is kind of a theory that I've been going more with over the past couple uploads. I did two recent uploads on O.J. Simpson when we've really been talking about the likelihood of an accomplice being present. And meaning that to say that, excuse me, meaning to say that it is likely that O.J. would have had an accomplice during the murder. And years ago, I mentioned this, to someone. It was my sister, actually. And, just talking about how was the likelihood of OJ having, a partner in this, and she basically said, "So what? Big deal. OJ would still be a murderer." And I was like, "No, not so what. That would mean that somebody got away for being an accessory to murder." A lot of people look at the accomplice theory and they immediately think Jason Simpson, OJ's oldest son. They think Al Cowlings, the close friend. And there's a big thing we need to note about this. What we could have said is that, I mean, there's very little physical evidence at the crime scene, but the thing I was trying to express in my last upload is that I kind of put forward the theory that OJ stabbed both Ron and Nicole. If that were the case, then it's not really likely we're going to have bloody footprints from this fourth person at the crime scene, no matter who it is. In the book If I Did It, OJ reveals that it is somebody he calls Charlie, which he openly admits is a pseudonym. A lot of people think that could be Jason Simpson or it could be Al Cowlings. I mean, OJ says during the Judith Regan interview that Charlie was a friend that he had met recently, shortly before the murders. Like, it was someone he hadn't known for a very long time. You can interpret that what you will, think that's truthful or not. And a lot of the OJ truthers just kind of explain the If I Did It book as, hey, the guy needed money, he needed the book deal. And from Kim Goldman, Fred Goldman's daughter, she openly says OJ got $800,000 to participate in the book deal. And, not only did he get the money, but he spent it immediately covering, legal fees and owed debts. And, I mean, he used it to settle certain amounts of debts. So, even no matter what way you sort of look at that, it's like OJ needed the money, you could say that. So that's kind of the way the OJ truthers interpret that. But I would say, though, that the biggest thing that I took away from these kind of Porkins Policy Radio things is the interviews with Steven Singular. But we're still on the accomplice theory, mind you. One thing that I didn't know previously was Al Cowlings, AC, owned a white Bronco. What he was saying was, OJ owned a white Bronco, so AC bought a white Bronco. I didn't really know that there were two white Broncos. So, when they're doing the high-speed crime chase, OJ is in AC's white Bronco. And of course, there is blood evidence found in OJ's white Bronco. They're two different cars, same make and model, two white Broncos. And well, that would really kind of change a lot of things because we do have eyewitness accounts of a white Bronco leaving Bundy around the time of the murder. I want to say the woman's name was Jill Shively. I always sort of like, when I first heard her name, I thought it was Jill Stein, like the Green Party candidate, but then it turned out it sounds similar, but not quite. Jill Shively. She's the woman who appeared on Hard Copy, and she kind of testified on Hard Copy, the television show, that she saw a white Bronco with a driver whom she believed to be O.J. Simpson leaving the Bundy estate at that time. And we also have an eyewitness report of a white Bronco with two African American males in it around, that time leaving Bundy, leaving the area where the crime scene would have occurred. So what this is kind of insinuating is that there was a white Bronco there, most likely OJ's, because as far as we know, well, I mean, we could say it almost with certainty there was no blood evidence found in AC's white Bronco that had been used during the low-speed crime chase. And the reason why this individual named Jill that I mentioned didn't testify during the trial is Marcia Clark thought that her credibility had been diminished by appearing on Hard Copy, and she's like, I want nothing to do with her. And because she accepted $5,000 from Hard Copy to tell her story on television as opposed to testifying, and I don't sometimes like when it comes to the prosecution in this case, I mean, you really have to question their decisions. And ultimately, you have to because they lost. They did indeed lose this one. So, what those are some hard things to examine. I mean, there really is some hard things to examine. We have White Bronco in the area, sightings of an African American male matching OJ's description driving, as well as a possible second individual in the passenger seat. There could even be a third individual in the back seat because that was the sort of Norman Pardo theory that there were at least two people involved, maybe three. And I've mentioned that I thought perhaps Jason Simpson could have been an accessory. I don't believe Jason Simpson would have been involved with any physicality because, once again, he sustained no injuries. My sort of theory was that someone would have been attacking Ron Goldman and actually getting into the physical fist fighting with Ron Goldman, and then OJ would have finished him with the knife. And I don't believe that would be Jason Simpson because, once again, Jason didn't have any visible wounds. It's possible, but I don't believe that at this point. Now, we need to sort of say, though, Jason Simpson could have been involved. He could have had some prior knowledge. He could have had, kind of in on the scheme. He knew what was going on, but he didn't necessarily commit these murders. He might have even been sitting in the back seat or something, because I insist Norman Pardo suggests that there were at least two, meaning at least two accomplices, that's to say, meaning three people would have been in the Bronco that night. So that's a second alternate theory. There's also been the possibility that was mentioned in one of our comments about a second set of footprints that were found that did not belong to OJ, that they didn't match the Bruno Mali shoes, and of course they weren't Ron's or Nicole's. I believe that they did address that though in the Is OJ Innocent miniseries, the Martin Sheen one, where it's like they said that that was a pattern that was caused from Ron Goldman's body hitting the ground, and I believe it was like an imprint from something from his shirt. So said that particular miniseries. I think it's been a while since I've watched that one. And now we have to go back to an additional one. One of the sort of most far out and extreme things that we have is kind of just like that this was actually something that was orchestrated by white supremacists. And I do kid you not. I mean, like, this is like a theory that people are putting out there. And I think it ties in heavily to that first kind of Mark Furman theory that they wanted to destroy O.J. Simpson because he was a successful black man and stuff like that. And that this was something that was organized by the white supremacists as well as, someone like Mark Furman who had connections to a variety of things and openly, supported well, I mean, I was about to say he supported neo Nazis. He had Nazi material in his house, and apparently he got in touch with neo-Nazi groups after the OJ trial. That was another thing that Steven Singular mentioned. But once again, though, it's like I just don't really know about how plausible something like that would be. I definitely get the feeling, I get the vibe that OJ would have been involved with this, but some of the alternative things that people are putting forward, or things we've mentioned in the past, there was a phone call that could have been made at 11 o'clock from Nicole to her mother that would have completely affected the timeline because OJ would have been at the limo. He would have been driving in his limo to the airport, and he wouldn't have. He had an alibi. I mean, there are also some things that would be going on where it's like OJ apparently did not have the cut on his hand until he got to Chicago, which means he wouldn't have been bleeding. And I read this kind of really far out statement that they didn't find any blood in his hotel room. You know, like like he says he broke his finger on a glass in his hotel room in Chicago. That's how he got the famous cut on his hand. And they were like, well, they didn't find any blood in the hotel room. And it's like, I mean, have you ever cut your finger before? I mean, like, have you ever done that? Sometimes, yeah, you'll their blood goes everywhere. Other times, the blood doesn't appear for a while. You know, if it's a really fine cut. I mean, you can see the blood starting to form, and you grab a tissue or something, and then you stop it up, and I mean, it doesn't mean you're going to be bleeding all over the place. Even if it is a really deep cut, it's just sometimes the blood doesn't gush out everywhere. And they also say that OJ was signing autographs at the airport and nobody noticed a cut on his hand. But once again, like someone brought that to my attention in the comments section on a previous upload, mind you. That's where I'm getting that from. And but I mean, like I was reading on, I think it was still on Ranker.com. They're talking about the thing that there's no blood evidence in his hotel room in Chicago, therefore he must have cut his hand in Los Angeles. And I was like, well, I don't. That's not. That's not certainty. I mean, you can cut yourself and then you sort of just grab a tissue immediately and you press it on the wound before it goes everywhere. Like I have to insist. Have you ever cut your hand and didn't bleed all over the floor? I mean, of course, we've all done that. So I don't think that's too solid. And like F. Lee Bailey's theory that this was a case of mistaken identity, it's that it's really something that we can just kind of explore that this could have been involved with the drug trade. I mean, I don't think that his theory is that plausible, to be honest. I have to kind of take back a little bit of what I said. I mean, if that's what happened, that's what happened. I mean, so there is a definitive answer here. What I think is actually a little bit more likely is something that we had talked about in the past, that this was not a case of mistaken identity. OJ talks quite frequently about Nicole Brown's connections to Faye Resnick, who was, the friend that went to rehab days prior to her murder. And he's like, they were involved together. Faye Resnick had a she had drug debts. She had problems with, the drug dealers, and that violence carried over to Nicole. It's like, in short, a lot of people online are just trying to say that Nicole Brown had a series of issues with the drug dealers that from La Mezzaluna, including Ron Goldman, because a lot of people are saying now that Ron Goldman wasn't only a partner of Nicole. I mean like a boyfriend girlfriend thing. They weren't only a couple. They were also like Ron was her drug dealer, for more or less. So I think it'd be much more plausible if they were specifically targeted by individuals who wanted kind of to settle a score associated with a drug debt. Bear in mind, Ron Goldman's throat was not cut the same way Nicole's was. Nicole was almost completely decapitated, whereas Ron's was not. So, I mean, there's the people who think that that's kind of the signature of the drug lords or something. Well, Nicole's throat was cut and Ron's was not. Other people kind of interpret that as the throat being slit with Nicole, that this was, something very angry. This was something that got out of control. And this was something that someone was expressing an enormous amount of rage. So, what really happened, though, What do you think, though, about the O.J. Simpson case? Do you think that this is actually the case of just one person with one knife who perhaps went over to Nicole Brown's house to slash her tires, who was just stalking his ex wife and really kind of angry, and then it turned into a bloody altercation? Is that what happened? Or is this something different? Is this something where somebody tried to kill Nicole and Ron because of a drug score that they wanted to settle, and then the racist police detectives knew who O.J. Simpson was, they knew who Nicole Brown was, so they decided to frame him and plant evidence on him out of racial hatred? Is that what happened? Because it seems like that's the kind of dichotomy that's going on with a lot of the alternative theories. And then there is what I've kind of put forward that I genuinely believe that OJ participated in the murders, but he had help from multiple people. I mean, definitely one person also present at the crime scene, and as I said, a third person, most likely Jason Simpson, would have had prior knowledge. And there are a few reasons for that, but we've discussed that on previous uploads. What do you think? Do you think this is sort of a one person, one knife thing? Is this kind of a frame up by the police, completely unaffiliated with O.J. Simpson? Or is this a case of multiple attackers? What do you think? If